Hello again. Terrible if I fell short, then it's going to stay where I put it. So yeah, good morning everyone. Good morning again. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning and to be able to bring you this message. And yeah, if you were here last week, you will know that we've started this mini-series. This mini-series of questions Jesus asked, focusing on the Gospel of Matthew. And last Sunday, Ryan, you started our series, didn't you, by bringing us a message from Matthew 6. It was Matthew 6, 25 to 34, with the question Jesus asking, why do you worry? And as you will have heard from the children's talk and the reading we just had, this morning we're in Matthew 8, verses 23 to 27, which is the story, of course, of Jesus calming the storm with his disciples in that boat on the Sea of Galilee. And the question Jesus asked his disciples in that moment is, why are you afraid? The disciples were so terrified, weren't they? They were terrified for their lives as they were being tossed about in the boat on that sea. And they were sure that they would die as Jesus slept throughout it all. It's as if the disciples had forgotten who it was that was actually with them in that boat during the storm. And it can feel like that for us too sometimes, can't it? We can forget so easily that we have an amazing God, an all-powerful and all-loving and an all-knowing God who is by our side throughout everything that happens to us, every trial and tribulation we go through. Jesus is with us every day, just like he was with the disciples in that boat. And it's that question, why are you afraid, and this scene from Matthew 8 that we're going to be studying together this morning. We're going to be studying through the verses of this story and also flicking through a few other parts of Scripture too. So if you've got a Bible to hand, keep it open, keep it with you. Most of the verses will be up on the screen behind me too to help follow along. So in this section of Matthew 8, we see the disciples, they get into the boat with Jesus and they get tossed about in this terrible storm. And eventually they cry out to Jesus for help, and Jesus calms the storm, and the waters were made calm in an instant, and they were made at peace. So Chris, you've just read for us those verses. Hopefully they're on the screen, clicker's working. I just want to read it very quickly, just as we get started. So from verse 23. So then Jesus, he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. And suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. And the disciples, they went and they woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. And he replied, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? And then he got up, and he rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. And the men, they were amazed, and they asked, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So to set the scene, as we get started. A few months ago, my wife Beck and I, she's at work today, she's not here, but we had the opportunity to go to Florida, Miami, Florida, okay? And midweek, we drove down, all the way down through Florida, through the Florida Keys, to the very bottom of the United States, to a place called Key West. So it's actually right there at the very bottom of the drawing, a place called Key West. And it was fantastic. But to be honest, even just to drive down there is amazing. You're driving along this highway and there's just ocean on either side of you. Just crystal clear blue ocean. It's incredible. And in the water, either side of you, extremely often, you see lots of boats. You see some big, some small, some people fishing, some people just having a party or something like that. Regardless though, people down there, they love getting out there in their boats. And I read a news article recently about a highly experienced 70-year-old sailor called Thomas, who had just bought a boat, a new 34-foot sailboat from Marathon in the Florida Keys. So Marathon's down there somewhere too, it's a town in the Florida Keys. And Thomas, he was planning to sail this boat home, up along Florida's west coast, back to where he lived in Tampa. And he described his new purchase as a racing-style boat that pivots on a dime. Sounds great, sounds lovely, this boat. This happened in August. And Thomas, he'd been hearing reports that there was this hurricane, this storm that was coming in his kind of general area. It was called Hurricane Debbie, was the name of this storm. And it was starting to form out at sea, but he thought he'd planned his trip well enough so that he would sail back home to Tampa before Hurricane Debbie got to where he was sailing in his new boat. Well, can anyone guess what happened to Thomas in his new boat? The hurricane swept in much quicker than he was expecting, much faster than he thought it would, and it crashed into his new boat while he was still halfway up Florida's west coast. He was nowhere near his final destination when that happened. And the storm, it was so powerful that the boat got tossed about so much that the main mast snapped off eventually, and the main sail was torn off and blew out to sea. So he was left in the middle of this storm, completely out of control, battling 20-foot waves in a boat that was now completely useless. And remember, Thomas was an experienced sailor. No matter what he tried, it was hopeless though. There was literally nothing he could do to save himself in this situation. And eventually, he decided to call out Mayday, and the Coast Guard sent a plane and a helicopter to try and rescue him. They were able to find him, and they dropped down a cable from the helicopter to pull him up out of the boat into the safety of the helicopter. And when he made it back home to Tampa eventually, not in this boat obviously, when he made it back home, he was interviewed for that news article I was reading, and Thomas was reported as saying, "I'm definitely going to get another boat, trust me." He clearly didn't learn from that mistake. But this certainly sounds like a crazy story, doesn't it? But I wonder whether you've ever felt tossed about like that yourself, like you're being knocked from place to place, decision to decision without any control. Perhaps you feel like, despite your best efforts, best made plans, things just don't seem to be going your way. Do you ever feel like you're going through the storms of life? Maybe you feel like that at the moment. Maybe you feel like Thomas. Maybe you've even seen the storms coming like Thomas did, if you think you can handle them yourself, like he did. Maybe you're feeling afraid like the disciples did in that storm on the Sea of Galilee. Well, this morning's talk we have called Why Are You Afraid? Once tossed about and now at peace, because that's what this passage is about, right? It's what our lives as people, it's what it's like to live as a Christian is like. We're tossed about and we can be afraid, but we are made at peace through Jesus. So I've got three main points from this passage that we're going to unpack together this morning, and they should be on the screen. So, uncontrollable, first of all. Uncontrollable. We don't know what life will throw at us. The second is unavoidable, and that is that we face a greater storm, a storm greater than the storms that life throws at us, greater even than the storms we throw at ourselves sometimes through the things we do to ourselves. It's a storm that each and every one of us will face, without a doubt, and that is the storm of God's judgment. And third and finally, unprecedented, and that is the idea that we can have unprecedented, unmatchable peace through Jesus. We do not need to be afraid. So as I said, we're going to be studying through this part of Matthew 8 and flicking to a few other parts of the Bible too, so if you've got your Bible, keep it to hand. So without further ado, let's get stuck into it. So as I'm sure every single person in this room can relate to, we don't really know what life will throw at us, do we? We make plans and predictions for the future. We feel like we're in control, like we're in our comfort zone, but more often than not, curveballs come our way which scupper those plans, and they throw everything up in the air. We read in verse 23 that Jesus got into the boat and his disciples followed him. And we know from Mark and Luke's accounts, their gospel accounts of this story, that Jesus had been preaching at the edge of the Sea of Galilee to a large crowd of people. And at the end of this day, Jesus knew that the best way to get to where they were going was to cross the Sea of Galilee, rather than going around the outside, walking around the outside, and then potentially being mobbed by crowds of people that had been listening to him preach all day. And the boat that they were getting into would have been a fishing boat. And we know that many of the disciples were fishermen by trade before they became followers of Jesus, don't we? So Peter, his brother Andrew, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, they were fishermen. And therefore this scene, it would have been very familiar to these men. These guys knew what it was like to be in a fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee. They would have done this very act probably hundreds of times before this day. And for context, it's widely recorded. That's the Sea of Galilee, by the way. For context, it's widely recorded that there would typically be more than 300 boats on the Sea of Galilee at any one time. So it's almost certain that there were dozens of other boats nearby to this one that Jesus and his disciples were in. So it says in verse 23 that the disciples followed Jesus into the boat to sail across the sea after this day of preaching to the crowds. But verse 24 it then says that suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. So as we've just said, the disciples and Jesus had had a very busy day, and were more likely than not just ready to chill out in the evening and get some well-earned rest. And we know that Jesus definitely needed rest because it appears that he almost immediately fell asleep in the boat. He fell sound asleep as soon as they got in. And the disciples, they were probably looking forward to spending a little while in the evening, just enjoying being out on a fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee again. This was their comfort zone at the end of the day. It was something that they loved and maybe something they hadn't had a chance to do for a while. But as we read just now, things didn't go to plan for them. This furious storm, it came up on the lake without warning. Mark and Luke's Gospels describe this as a squall. So a squall is a sudden, sharp increase in wind speed. And to make matters worse, the waves swept over the boat and threatened to swamp it entirely. The Sea of Galilee is an unusual stretch of water. It's not actually a sea, it's just like a massive lake. It's 13 miles long and about 7 or 8 miles wide, so to give you an idea of how big it is. And apparently, storms like this are quite common, even still to this day. Storms on this lake are quite common. They can appear over the surrounding mountains. As they come over the mountains and they come down onto the lake, they pull the waves of the lake up and they turn into these violent, dangerous waves. Now I mention this because storms on this lake were fairly common. They'd happened before. This was not some random, rare occasion. As I mentioned earlier, the disciples were hardy fishermen. This was their comfort zone. They had been on this lake, probably in storms, many times before. And I mention this because it makes me think that this storm was somehow different. It must have been incredibly dangerous, and they were very afraid and completely powerless to help themselves. Despite their experience and their intentions of having a restful journey that evening across the lake, things didn't go to plan for them. Things didn't go as they thought they would. They were being battered by this storm, and things had got completely out of control. Maybe not quite this extreme, but life can definitely feel like that for us too, can't it sometimes? Life can feel like being on a stormy sea, being tossed from one problem to another, one day to the next. Times like this make us realise that we are very small, which can make us feel helpless. Yes, that's an artist's impression of what this storm looked like, apparently. Things like this can be quite humbling too, can't they? The sailor I mentioned at the beginning, Thomas, he was an experienced sailor. And even though he knew that hurricane was coming his way, he thought to himself, I'm experienced, I know what I'm doing, I reckon I can outrun that storm, I can be home before tea, it'll be fine. But despite his best efforts, he was humbled. He was humbled in the process. And I imagine it was the same for the disciples. In this moment they panicked, and they didn't know what to do. They were very afraid, and they thought that they were all alone. Psalm 107. It's up there on the screen, verses 23 to 32. It includes a story that's very similar to this one. It tells the story of merchants who set out on ships on the mighty waves. And because they were merchants, they probably made plans to travel from one port to another to sell goods and make some money. And in this psalm, it says that God spoke and stirred up a tempest. The tempest is an extremely powerful and violent storm, and it lifted high the waves and it crashed into their boat. And it goes on to say that in the merchant's peril, their courage melted away. They were terrified. On their journey, Psalm 107 says that the men saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. That's verse 24, I think, if you're looking at it on the screen. A different translation says that they too observed the Lord's power in action and his impressive works on the deepest seas. And reading this, I think we're supposed to assume that the merchants, the sailors in the psalm, they knew God. They believed that God existed, and they could not deny it because they saw God's hand at work when they were out at sea. They saw the mighty oceans, and they knew that they must have been created by a powerful God. And it's exactly the same, obviously, for the disciples in this boat with Jesus. They had spent lots of time with Jesus. And not only this, but they had seen him perform miracles. And they could also see the power of God, God's creation during this storm on Lake Galilee. Romans 1 verse 20 says, For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And I'm mentioning this point here because basically these verses in Romans are saying that the creation around us, all that we can see, it points to the existence of God. These merchants in this psalm, they couldn't deny that God existed because they were surrounded by his magnificent creation. And the disciples in their fear had kind of forgotten about Jesus and the fact that he was right there in the boat with them, sleeping. I've talked a lot so far about people making plans and preparations and thinking you're prepared for what's coming. The disciples planning that relaxing evening across the lake after that busy day, and also those merchants in the psalm. But in reality, we don't really know what life is going to throw at us. These guys in Matthew 8 and the Psalm 107, they didn't either. And I just wanted to say this. Several times in the Bible, it talks against people making plans without putting God in them. People who make plans or decisions for their lives without considering what God's will might be or where God might fit into it. And one of these times is James 13 to 16. It says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes, and all such boasting is evil." It's not a bad thing to make plans, of course not. Obviously it's a good and sensible thing to make plans, and many of you here, particularly younger people here, you're at a point in your life where you're going to be making some big decisions. You've got some difficult decisions ahead of you. The point I'm making is just that they will disappoint you if you keep God out of them. They will disappoint you if you forget where Jesus is, where Jesus will fit into those plans. Those verses from James, they say quite clearly that making decisions without God is arrogant and evil. We don't know what life will throw at us. The storms of life are too unpredictable and uncontrollable without God in it. And the disciples, they were terrified during that storm on the Sea of Galilee, even though Jesus was right there in the boat beside them. The Bible tells us that if we keep God at the centre of our planning, he will never disappoint you. And I'd encourage you to pray to God about keeping him at the centre of your decision making. Despite the disciples knowing Jesus and seeing his power firsthand, when this uncontrollable storm came, they forgot all about him and they were afraid. That was my first point. The other ones are shorter, I promise. So the second point you need this morning is perhaps the most challenging. And it's that every single one of us here faces a greater storm. And that is a storm greater than those that the world throws at us. It's a storm greater than things we throw at ourselves sometimes. It's a storm that we cannot ignore. We cannot try and outrun like Thomas did with that hurricane. It's the storm of God's judgment. When I was talking about Psalm 107, you will have noticed in verse 25 that, if I can find it, verse 20. There you go. Verse 25, that God spoke and he stirred up the tempest, which lifted the waves and crashed into the merchants in their boat. Why would God do that? Why would God, what would he do that for? Why would God want the psalmist even to write that in Psalm 107 and show it to us? Why does God allow the storm to happen even in Matthew 8? Well, firstly, I think it's for the same reason that we see Jesus rebuking the storm in verse 26 of Matthew. It's supposed to remind us that creation is God's. God made everything in creation, and it's his to control as he pleases. The oceans are his, the Sea of Galilee is his, and the storm is his. These are examples of God's power and supposed to show us that God is almighty and all-powerful over everything. But secondly, I believe, it's supposed to show us that God judges people. We know that God is described as being perfect and just. And God's perfection, it's the standard that everything else is judged against, including us, our lives, the things we do. There is nothing that we can do to reach that level of perfection ourselves. God being described as just means he behaves according to what is right and fair. And as I said, God judges all people against his perfect standard, which none of us are able to meet on our own. None of us are good enough. Those merchants in the psalm, they'd gone against God's way. They hadn't included him in their plans. They were being arrogant and thought that they knew what was best. They were masters of their own lives. They were putting themselves first and not God. And the disciples, despite everything that they knew and had seen Jesus do firsthand, they'd forgotten about it all. And they had been overcome with fear and didn't put their faith in Jesus, who was right there in the boat with them. Does that sound familiar to any of you? I know it does for me sometimes, especially when you're caught up in the busyness of life, you get distracted, and it can be really difficult to put God first. It can be really difficult to rely on Jesus and instead try to do things my own way and forget that He knows what's best for me and has the power to fix the bad situations that I find myself in. The reason why I mention this psalm, other than the obvious parallels with Matthew 8, the story of Matthew 8, is because I think this point about God's judgment is so important. And also the hindsight that we have now, because we have the full Bible at our disposal, whereas the psalmist disciples didn't. We will all face God's judgment if we don't make ourselves right before God. And often God doesn't punish us immediately for things we do wrong. When we die, though, we will meet our Creator face to face. And we will have to answer for the things that we've done. And it's important, this is important, because it's at that point we will be judged for the sins in our lives, the wrong things we've done, and the times we didn't put our faith in Jesus, and the times we've gone against God. When I was 8 years old, I remember hearing that for the first time, that God loves me, but will also judge me. Romans 2, not that one? Oh yeah, thanks, I skipped back. There we go. God will repay each person according to what they have done. And the New Living Translation of the Bible says that He will judge everyone according to what they have done. It's very easy for us to sometimes ignore that fact. We prefer to think of God as loving and peaceful, which He definitely is too. But the Bible reminds us that we will face the storm of God's judgment, and we need to ensure that we're ready and made right before God, before that day comes. But the fantastic news here is that there is a way to be made right in God's eyes, and that's through Jesus. And that brings me on to my final point this morning. And that is that we can have unprecedented peace, unmatchable peace through Jesus. Jesus is our only hope, like He was for the disciples in Matthew 8. I imagine that as the storm was battering against their fishing boats, they probably tried several things to try and recover the situation. Maybe they took the mainsail down to make it a bit more controllable in the wind and were using the oars to try and move the boat forwards instead. Maybe as the waves crashed over the boat and it risked swamping it, they got a bucket and were trying to pail some water out to stop it from sinking. We get a sense from reading the account that they tried a few things to save themselves as Jesus was sound asleep in the boat. Eventually, though, they reached their wits' end. And they knew that there was nothing that they could do to save themselves. The storm was uncontrollable and they were powerless in this situation. And eventually, when they realised that they couldn't save themselves, they cried out to the Lord for help, didn't they? And He answered them and saved them. Verse 25 says that the disciples went and woke Jesus, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." If we're going through a particularly stormy part of our lives, sometimes we can have a tendency to feel like God can't work or won't work to help us, a bit like maybe the disciples did. When we're in these seasons, we need to respond like how the disciples eventually did in verse 25, by calling out to Him and asking for help, asking Him to give us the strength we need, that we realise that we just don't have ourselves. Thinking back to that story of Thomas sailing his new boat from Florida Keys back to Tampa, when his mast snapped and his mainsail blew off into the ocean, he had no hope of saving himself. He did the only thing that he knew he could do. He had no other options. And he called Mayday, didn't he? That's what I said at the start. He called Mayday, and the Coast Guard came and they sent a helicopter to rescue him. And I think sometimes we can be a bit stubborn, a bit prideful, not always, but I think it's harder for us guys sometimes. Maybe we don't like to admit that we need help. We don't like to admit that we can't do things on our own. Maybe it's a sign of weakness. But in reality, it's so important. In Matthew 7, verse 7, Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Jesus promises to answer our prayers. When the disciples cried out to Jesus for help, he rebuked the storm, and it became completely calm in an instant. He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And then he got up and he rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm, it says in verse 26. Can you imagine the relief the disciples must have felt when it grew calm and still, and they knew that they were finally safe? The disciples had forgotten who Jesus was and the power he has, and that is why they were so afraid, and why he felt he needed to challenge them on this by saying, "You of little faith." It's important to remember that Jesus is our only hope in the storms of life. He is the only one who can make us at peace and bring us to safety, like he did with the disciples in this story. Jesus is the calmer of physical storms, but he is also the calmer of storms of our troubled hearts too. For the disciples, they felt like Jesus was unaware or unconcerned because he was sleeping. Theirs was a physical storm, but storms in our lives come in lots of different forms. Think about the storms in your life, the things that you're going through at the moment, things that cause you to have great fear and anxiety, whatever it is you're going through. You have two main options, I think. You can assume that Jesus no longer cares about you like the disciples did, as the storm was battering their boat, or you can resist fear and put your trust in him. If you feel like you're struggling to have faith in Jesus at the moment because of what you're going through, if you feel like panicking and being fearful because of your situation, come to God in prayer and confess this to him and ask him to help you, to take care of you, and to calm that storm. As Matthew 7 verse 7 says, ask and it will be given to you. As always, we have a prayer team down that corridor at the end of the service, and people would be more than happy to pray with you about the things you're going through at the moment if you feel like you're struggling. Please do make use of that this morning before you go home if you need that. When the disciples saw the ease with which Jesus was able to calm the storm with his words, they were truly awestruck. Verse 27 says that the men were amazed, and they asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." At this moment, the disciples stopped being afraid, and they realized how incredible Jesus was. Because he's the Son of God, he has the power to calm the storm, stop the storm, just like he also has the power to create the storm that threw those merchants into the ocean in Psalm 107. We've talked a lot about physical storms this morning, and the storms in our lives that Jesus has the power to calm for us if we put our trust in him. But there is that other storm that I mentioned earlier on. And that's the storm of God's judgment. And just like how Jesus asked his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" about that physical storm they faced, I just want to stop and ask you, are you afraid of God's judgment? Have you asked God to forgive you for the things that you've done wrong? Or are you still trying to deal with it in your own strength? Jesus bore the storm of God's judgment when he died on the cross. Jesus took all of the sin that we have committed, suffering God's judgment that we deserve to take ourselves. And he did that so that we could experience that peace that the disciples felt when that storm stopped and was made calm. We can imagine the relief they felt as their fear melted away and the storm went to nothing in an instant when they were out on the Sea of Galilee. And it's like that for us when we ask Jesus into our lives, when we say sorry for the things that we've done wrong, and ask him to forgive us and make us right before him. We need to call out Mayday and ask Jesus to rescue us. And I just want to say, have you done that yet? Ask yourself in your own heart, have you asked Jesus to help you? Have you called Mayday? When you become a Christian and accept that gift that Jesus offers, you will still experience storms. If your path in life is not plain sailing if you become a Christian. And I'm sorry if this is the first time you're hearing that. But the good news is that we know that Jesus will never leave us. You have a friend by your side who has the power to rebuke storms, keeping them at bay, and is able to bring you home to safety as well. And when it comes time to face God's judgment, God will look at you and see that you are blameless, not because of anything that you have done, but because his son Jesus has paid that price and taken the punishment away that you deserved. We don't need to be afraid of that anymore. So, as I start to come to a close, this morning we've looked at how the storms of life are uncontrollable. We don't know what life will throw at us, and therefore it's important to make sure that God is at the centre of our plans. And secondly, we looked at how each one of us will face an unavoidable storm of God's judgments, which we must make sure we're prepared for. And finally, we've just thought about how unprecedented the peace is that we can experience through Jesus when we accept the gift of forgiveness that he offers us. So, how should we respond to all of this? Well, we see in Matthew 8, verse 27, that the disciples were amazed, and they asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." And in Psalm 107, verse 31, it says that as the merchants, they gave thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds. And that is how we should respond, with thanksgiving and praise for the peace that we can experience through life's storms, but also the gift of forgiveness, which is offered to each one of us freely by God. Jesus asked his disciples in that boat, "Why are you so afraid?" Are you afraid? If you are, please ask Jesus to go with you through the storms of life. To close, I just want to read a short extract from Charles Spurgeon's commentary on Psalm 107, because I think it's really helpful. And then I am done, I promise. Charles Spurgeon says this: "Though at their wits' end, the men still had wit enough to pray. Their hearts were melted, and it ran out as cries for help. This was well, and it ended well. For it's written in the Bible that God brought them out of their distresses. Prayer is good in a storm. We may pray staggering and reeling, and pray when we are at our wits' end. God will hear us amid the thunder and answer us out of the storm." We should respond with prayer, with prayers of praise and thanksgiving for what Jesus has done in taking us from being tossed about to being made at peace. Thank you. I'm going to pray, and then the music team, if you want to come up while I'm praying, we're going to sing a final song to close. Dear Lord, I thank you for this famous story from Matthew's Gospel, about how the disciples were out on that boat as that storm came, and they were terrified. They didn't know what to do. And after being afraid and trying various different things to try and save themselves, they realised that the only thing that could save them, the only thing they could do, was to cry out to you for help. And all they could do was wake you up and ask you to save them. And Lord, I just pray that no matter what we are going through in our lives at the moment, so many different things going on in this room and different things in people's lives, I pray, Lord, that you would help us to remember that you are our only hope.